All right, let's talk about one of the most unbelievable, most chaotic, and just downright dangerous events in the entire history of sports. We're diving into the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis.
And, calling it chaotic might be the understatement of the century. This race was so poorly planned, so full of bizarre, almost comical mishaps, it honestly feels like something out of a movie. But nope, it all really happened.
I mean, just look at this. The guy who crossed the finish line first cheated. He hitched a ride in a car. The man who was eventually declared the actual winner was literally fueled by a mix of brandy and rat poison to keep him on his feet. Oh, and yeah, actual wild dogs chased competitors off the course. It was a complete disaster from start to finish.
So, how on earth did an official Olympic event go so horribly, horribly wrong? Well, to understand that, you really have to look at the setting.
You see, the 1904 Olympics weren't the main event, not even close. They were basically just a sideshow to the massive St. Louis World's Fair. The games were spread out over months, nobody really knew what was going on, and they were mostly ignored. This total lack of focus meant the whole thing was run with an amateurish vibe, which for the marathon runners would have deadly serious consequences.
The organizers didn't just have a bad day. It's almost like they intentionally created a perfect storm of awful conditions for these athletes. It was a true recipe for disaster.
First off, the heat. The race was held in late August in St. Louis. We're talking 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 32 Celsius, with just crushing humidity. It was absolutely brutal before the race even started. And in that kind of heat, over a course that was nearly 25 miles long, you have to ask, how many water stops were there? 10? Maybe 5? Nope. This number right here, it's 2. Just 2 water stations for the entire race. For miles and miles, these runners had nothing. And believe it or not, it gets worse. The course was all unpaved country roads. The official cars and vehicles following the race kicked up these enormous clouds of dust, basically creating a thick, choking fog that the athletes had to run through. On top of that, they threw in 7 huge hills. It was a total nightmare. And here's the kicker, the part that's just so hard to believe. This wasn't just incompetence, it was a deliberate choice. The chief organizer, a guy named James Sullivan, actually had this twisted idea that withholding water was a good way to test the runners' toughness. This one misguided belief was the direct cause of so much of the suffering that day. Okay, so let's get into the race itself and see how all these terrible conditions led to a series of just unbelievable events. This is where the story goes from tragic to truly, truly absurd. So meet Fred Lorz. He was the first man to cross the finish line. The crowd went wild, he was celebrated as the winner, and he was just moments away from getting the gold medal from President Roosevelt's daughter. But there was a tiny problem with his victory. Here's how it all went down. About 9 miles in, Lorz gets cramps, so he just hops into his manager's car. He rides for the next 11 miles, waving at other runners as he zooms past. Then the car breaks down, so he just gets out and jogs the rest of the way to the finish line to claim his prize. When he got caught, he tried to claim it was all just a joke. Right. So, with Lorz disqualified, the gold medal goes to the runner-up Thomas Hicks. But his story is even more disturbing. Hicks was literally falling apart on the course, and his trainers had to resort to some very extreme and very dangerous measures. To keep him going, they gave him strychnine. And let's be perfectly clear on what that is. Strychnine is a highly toxic poison. In tiny doses, yeah, it acts as a stimulant, but in larger doses, it's literally rat poison. This was an unbelievably risky thing to do. This poor guy was in a horrible state. He was hallucinating, completely delirious from dehydration, and instead of giving him water, his trainers just kept giving him more strychnine mixed with egg whites and brandy. He was so completely broken by the end that his trainers had to physically carry him across the finish line. He lost 8 pounds during the race and was lucky to even survive. But not every story from that day was so grim. In fact, let me introduce you to Felix Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who might just be the most amazing character in the whole race. So this guy's journey was already an adventure. He lost all his money gambling in New Orleans and had to hitchhike to St. Louis. He shows up at the starting line in his street clothes and has to cut the legs off his pants to make shorts. During the race, he gets hungry, stops to eat some apples from an orchard, which gives him terrible stomach cramps, so he decides to just take a nap. And after all of that,
He wakes up and still manages to finish in 4th place. It's incredible.
The chaos didn't stop there. Another runner, William Garcia, was found unconscious on the side of the road, nearly dead from internal bleeding caused by breathing in all that dust. And then you have 2 runners from South Africa who were chased a full mile off the course by a pack of stray dogs. You just can't make this stuff up.
So, what's the point of looking back at this absolute train wreck of a race? Well, believe it or not, this complete catastrophe actually ended up having a really profound and positive legacy for sports.
This comparison really says it all. The epic failures of 1904 served as a huge flashing warning sign. The 2 pathetic water stops, that led to modern marathons having aid stations almost every mile. The use of strychnine, that paved the way for strict anti-doping rules. The near fatalities, now we have full medical teams on standby. In a very real way, every marathon runner today is safer because of how terribly wrong this race went.
So when you look back, the big takeaway is pretty clear. The race was a spectacular failure that forced the entire world of sports to get serious about athletes' safety. It was a brutal lesson for sure, but maybe a necessary one. And that really leaves us with a bigger question to think about. The 1904 marathon shoved athletes deep into the territory of reckless danger. Today, we admire athletes for their grit and their endurance. But how do we make sure we're always honoring that challenge without ever crossing that line back into chaos? It's definitely something worth thinking about.